Hello, and welcome to chapter 22. We're going to talk about the origin of species. Okay, first learning objective is really straightforward. You need to know the biological concept of species. Well, the definition is what I've given you here, which is just to say, defines species as a group of populations whose members have the potential to interbreed in nature, that's key, and produce viable fertile offspring, that's key, but do not do so with members of other groups. So the usefulness about this in nature part is to say, well, if two organisms aren't going to come in contact with one another, they are not going to interbreed in nature. And so that's where the lion and the tiger thing kind of comes up. Like one of them lives in Asia, one of them lives in Africa. They're not going to come in contact in nature. So they are not going to be the same species. Now, the second thing is that they produce viable, fertile offspring. So it's not just to say a boy and a girl can mate and produce a baby, but to say a boy and a girl can mate and produce a baby that is also capable of making babies. And so that's where this comes into play as well. This concept, biological species concept, is not based on physical similarity. And so that's where these diagrams come into play. We can look at two birds that look amazingly similar, but because they can't produce fertile offspring are actually considered to be separate species. And then we have humans that actually have very diverse appearances, far more diverse than our birds over here. But because we can interbreed, we are the same species. So that's what we're looking at here. It's not to do with physical similarity. It has to do with the ability of the babies. So then our next learning objectives, we're actually going to do two at once because it works off the same diagram. You must know the prezygotic and the postzygotic barriers that maintain reproductive isolation, and then you have to know a description of species that are maintained by each type of barrier. So we're going to remember that the definition of the biological species concept is just saying we have to have reproductive isolation in natural populations. That's the definition. So then, here's are the ways that can happen. We have prezygotic barriers and we have postzygotic barriers. And our prezygotic barriers over here, these are the things that prevent fertilization. Postzygotic barriers are the things that prevent the resulting progeny from actually being a species or a member of that species. So if we look at the prezygotic, so pre means before the zygote, so before the fertilized egg, we have habitat isolation, temporal isolation, behavioral. All of those prevent any kind of mating attempt from ever happening. We have mechanical and gametic isolation. This prevents if mating does attempt, or if the organisms attempt mating, this is what prevents fertilization. And then if fertilization takes place, that's when we get into that postzygotic barrier. So habitat selection, we live in two different places. Garter snake's a great example of that. This one is terrestrial and this one is aquatic. Very similar species, but because they live in two different places, they wouldn't come across each other. Even if you live in the same place, you might be temporally isolated. That can be simple, as though one's nocturnal and one's diurnal, as with the skunks here. Or it can also be, when is your breeding season? Is your breeding season in early spring versus late spring or something like that? So temporal isolation would also be a reproductive barrier. Behavioral isolation, that's the blue-footed boobies, where if you don't know the right behavior, you're not going to successfully attract a mate. Then, if you bypass all of these, you're in the right location, at the right time, behaving the right way, then a mating attempt might happen. If that happens, there are still two further prezygotic barriers that could prevent progeny. One is mechanical isolation, which very crudely just means that the parts don't fit. And so the example we had here with snails, and in class we talked about how this is the clockwise snail and this is the counterclockwise snail. But what that actually means is that the reproductive organs just don't line up. And then if this guy switches around to get over here, then the reproductive organ isn't actually large enough to get to where it needs to be over here. So mechanical isolation just means that it's physically not possible for reproduction. And then if mechanical isolation is successful, gametic isolation can also happen. Remember that when we're dealing with gametes, the sperm, if we're dealing with animals, the sperm has to actually get to the nucleus of the egg. And so the egg has to allow the sperm to get through that membrane. And so there are cell signals, protein receptors on those membranes that indicate that that should be there. And so gametic isolation is just saying that even though the sperm and the egg are in close proximity, the egg's not going to let it in because it doesn't have the right proteins on those membranes. So then, if that sperm actually makes it to fertilization of the egg and a baby develops, then we can have what's called postzygotic barrier. So after the zygote, things that are preventing species even still. We can have reduced hybrid viability. That is something that is weaker than both of the parent species and just not able to compete as well. We can have reduced hybrid fertility. That's where we get donkeys, mules, and horses, where a donkey, let's see, here's our donkey, here's our horse, here's our mule, which is the hybrid. He is sterile, okay? He cannot, mule plus mule doesn't make mule. And so that's an example of reduced hybrid fertility, that you can have this critter, but it's not its own species because it can't reproduce even with another mule. And then last but not least, we can have hybrid breakdown. That's actually most common with plants. And what that means is that each successive generation becomes weaker and weaker and weaker with time. And so hopefully this has addressed both of those learning objectives and you'll kind of keep all those things straight. You must know about allopatric and sympatric speciation, how they're similar and how they're different. So the examples we have for the speciation involves this land or this lake that has this finger of land here in the middle. And two ways that we can have speciation. Allopatric means different country, and then sympatric means same country. And allopatric speciation is just very simply saying, okay, well, somehow we have some kind of geographic barrier between the two. And when that happens, these populations become distinct. We no longer have gene flow between the two populations, which means any changes that happen on one side of the barrier are not being transferred to the other side of the barrier. Because these two populations change independently, it's possible that a reproductive isolation could be a result of that. And once they're isolated reproductively, now they're two separate species. In contrast to that over here, sympatric speciation means same country speciation occurs. And here we have a subset that forms without a geographic barrier. This is a little bit more rare. It's a little bit trickier to understand. It usually has to do with sexual selection or resource exploitation or something like that. So here's an example of allopatric speciation, so different country. The Isthmus of Panama. So we can look at this Isthmus of Panama developed much after the continents fell into place, pardon me, as Pangaea was moving everything around. But what we have here are two species of shrimp. These are your sister shrimp, and then these are sister species as well. But they were separated by this Isthmus of Panama, and then what ended up happening is that these two can no longer interbreed to produce offspring, and these two can no longer interbreed because even though they used to be one species, we have this geographic barrier, which was the development of Panama, and now they can't get to one another, and they have become reproductively isolated as a result of being geographically isolated. Sympatric speciation, this is, we talked in class about hawthorn flies. This is the easiest example I can think of that what happened is when Europeans came over from Europe, they brought with them the apples here, and this is the hawthorn fly, and this is the hawthorn tree. And before the Europeans brought over the apple, the flies all lived in the trees. Well, then the apples came over, and the flies found that this was also a suitable resource and a great place to lay your eggs. The trick was the apples became fruited earlier on in the season than did the hawthorn trees. And so the flies that laid their eggs here in the apples had to develop more quickly so that they were ready to lay their eggs when the apples were available to them. And so now what we have are two groups. We have the one group that uses the hawthorn berries, and we have one group that uses the apples, and these two groups, because their timing of reproduction is so different, they now very rarely interbreed. This is speciation. Because now we're looking at a temporal isolation that become a result of different resource exploitation. You must know how a change in chromosome number can lead to sympatric speciation. This is something that's way more common with plants. So here's why. Plants can self-pollinate, where the pollen from one flower can go to the stamen of another flower or the pistil of another flower, and seeds can be produced and whatnot. That's not something animals do. And so, which is mostly because an animal is either male or female, whereas with flowers, they have both male and female parts. And so, and plants for that matter. And so what happens is if there is an error in cell division with plants in the process of producing meiosis, well, I mean, so here's mitosis. We have our cell division error. We end up with a tetraploid cell, and then when gametes are formed, we end up with these two end cells that are instead of just haploid cells. Well, these two, because they can self-pollinate, there's a good chance that if you have the male gamete and you have the female gamete on the same plant, they're going to find each other. And so it only takes this one error right here to actually lead to polyploidy in plants and a successfully reproducing new species. So it's way easier in plants than in animals. No matter how the isolation occurs, though, reproductive isolation has to ultimately arise. So this isn't a learning objective, but it's a big deal. No matter what, just having a geographic barrier or just using different resources isn't speciation. What speciation is that those two groups stop experiencing gene flow between the two groups. And then over time, mutations accumulate in each of those groups that ultimately change or impact the ability for the two to then go back and reproduce together. That reproductive isolation is what's actually leading to the speciation event. All right, you must know why speciation rates are often rapid in situations when adaptive radiation occurs or during times of ecological stress. So we talked in class about the drought in the Galapagos Islands and what happened over time. Well, we talked about how the beak depth went from this, slightly less than 9 to almost 10 over a very short period of time. And so we didn't actually talk about this with regard to speciation, but I thought it was the easiest way to help you understand this idea. Well, the result the drought can cause speciation if, for example, we have some birds, let's say, because we're dealing with the Galapagos Islands, so let's say we have some birds on this island and some birds on this island, and they are not necessarily moving back and forth very often, but this island is subject to much more drought than this island is. So what's going to happen is these guys are going to have much larger beaks, become more suited to this particular island than to this island. And then over time, if these birds stop going back over here because they're not as suited to that environment, we can end up with reproductive isolation, and that is speciation. And so it's possible that during ecological stress, because individual populations of animals, or plants for that matter, become more suited to wherever they are, that can lead to reproductive isolation. It's just because you have to be such a specialist to your environment during ecological stress. You need to know the difference between punctuated equilibrium and gradualism that describe speciation. So here are the two models, and just to kind of keep in mind, what punctuated equilibrium is saying is that there's rapid change followed by stasis or equilibrium. Gradual model is just saying that all change is very, very, very slow. There's support for both of these at different times of environmental stress. When there is environmental stress, we tend to have faster changes that we notice. When there's not as much environmental stress, we tend to have slower models for change that we can collect data about. So just to understand the difference between the punctuated model, which is a lot of change very quickly followed by homeostasis, and the gradual model, which is just ever so gradually things change but pretty consistently. That's it for this chapter. I think only one more chapter in this unit. Thanks for watching. I will see you in class. Have a good day.